Hello, everyone. Welcome to another episode of Bolt Breakdowns here on the Guilty as Charged podcast YouTube channel. Where since I last podcasted, we've had a lot of things happen in Chargers land as far as results with Staley and Telesco both being fired after that Thursday night football loss from the Raiders. So we're definitely in a different place than when I did the post Broncos loss pod on this show a week ago. So I figured we have a lot of things to talk about, and from a GM coaching standpoint, and I don't want to honestly talk about what went right and what went wrong in the 63-21 Aidan O'Connell game. So I think for me this week, it was important to reframe the show with kind of the future content for the Chargers regarding the GM and coaching search, the draft, offseason moves, and all that kind of stuff. So that's why I reached out to you guys on Twitter and YouTube and asked for your best questions that I will answer on this episode. So I decided to make this episode a Q&A, town hall, if you will, because I didn't I didn't know if there's much to talk about with the Chargers team wise right now as far as 2023 objectives with like what's Gibb Smith going to do against the Bills. I think the focus certainly has shifted to 2024. So I thought it was appropriate to kind of pivot the show this week. So this will also be my last episode of the year. I will be flying back to the U.S. on the 23rd. So that's my excuse to not watch the Bills game live, which I'm sure will be an absolute destruction by Josh Allen and company. So yeah, that's a primetime game on the Peacock platform. But will probably be flying back to the U.S. that day after my semester. And so this is going to be my last episode until probably middle of next month in January. So I want to make this a little bit longer, take your guys' questions. And honestly, considering a lot of the GM head coaching stuff is going to take place in the offseason anyway, probably when I'm back to doing Bolt breakdowns in January, we'll have a lot more stuff resolved by then. But this is just in general to, talk about where we stand now, favorite candidates, et cetera, et cetera. So without any further ado, let's get into your guys' questions from YouTube. So this is from Sean Castro 4429. If the Chargers don't move these next three games, draft position, yeah, and they end up with the fifth pick in the draft, who would be your top three choices? Also, do you think Spanos would be reluctant to hire Harbaugh due to some personality concerns? Draft-wise, I think the situation for the Chargers is kind of this if they have a top five pick. To me, I think I would lean offensive playmaker. I know maybe that won't sit super right with people, regarding, the Quentin Johnson pick last year, obviously. So if you're doubling down at receiver or picking a tight end, are you addressing the other areas of the team as you need to? But if you're picking as high as 5, like I kind of think it's that or it's tackle, right? Fashanu will be available. Joel will be available. So if I had to kind of rank a top 3, again, I have not gotten into like all the film on these players. This is more of like a baseline knowledge thing in addition to some film I've watched. But again, I have not done like a full thorough, like, here's my grade on this prospect type of thing. Brock Bowers to me really is interesting with the 5th pick in terms of what he can do in the open field and what the NFL is kind of shifting to with tight ends. The Chargers have not had a difference maker in tight end in forever. As good as Hunter Henry was, or even like late stage Antonio Gates, right? I think that this is something that has been lacking with the team for a while, particularly since Hunter Henry left to New England. Gerald Everett's been fine, but I don't think he's that difference maker. Personally, I wouldn't mind having him back on the team for sure if he wants to return as tight end 1 or tight end 2 in some kind of circumstance. For sure, he's been pretty good. He's been one of the best parts of this season in terms of just watching him play from week to week. But I do think they need something more at that position. And you look at what Herbert did, even having somebody like Hunter Henry, who was just like a pretty good receiver and a competent blocker, and they had a nice chemistry. And Bowers is a way better receiver and guy that can get open and really, impact a game more so than Hunter Henry. I would say he's about as good of a blocker. He's not an amazing blocker by any means, but, adding that Kelsey component to your offense, I just think with how the modern NFL is shifting, and you see all these in-seam routes for tight ends all the time that Dak is hitting in Dallas, like the ability to really spread your offense out a little bit with a game-breaking tight end like Bowers really would interest me in terms of what the Chargers could do in the draft. I like Malik Neighbors a lot. He reminds me so much of kind of that, like a lot of people compare him to Jamar Chase. I think Jamar Chase was a little bit more physically imposing and a little less like overly athletic than Neighbors is. I think Neighbors is a bit more of like a fluid mover than like Chase. I don't know if that makes sense, but like to me, Chase again was a bit more like physically imposing. I trusted him more in like contested like catch situations than I would Neighbors. Neighbors is more like silky smooth route runner, and I think a higher degree of like that quick twitch athleticism than Jamar. I would kind of put him in that like Odell. He does remind me a lot of Odell. That's not just LSU helmet scouting. So I've seen some comps to like Antonio Brown. I'm not necessarily willing to go like that far on like ceiling. I mean, I think it's there, but to me, he does remind me a lot of like kind of a Odell level prospect coming out of college, of like a good first round wide receiver, and probably would be the number one guy in certainly in last year's class, considering the wide receiver group is just a little bit lacking as a whole last year. Certainly would be over Jackson Smith and Jigba, who was my wide receiver one. So Neighbors to me is interesting. And then after that, I think you go with maybe Alter for Shanu as like tied for third in terms of like my interest level in those guys, just because I think they do have to set up some type of succession plan for when Pipkins eventually does leave this team, probably most likely in 2025. I think he does start next year at tackle unless they take somebody in the first round. So, starting some kind of succession plan or moving Pipkins kind of into like a swing tackle role next year. If you really did take a guy that high and kind of build around him and Slater on, whether it's Alton Slater or Fashanu and Slater, that would be pretty nasty on the outside. Obviously, they still got to, fix stuff inside with Corey Linsley and that situation and figure out what they want to do with Zion and Jamari on the inside. But to me, I would be very interested to see, if they don't get one of those game-breaking playmaker type guys, what they could do with maybe one of those tackle prospects, considering this is probably going to be the Chargers' last chance to like pick that high for a while. If you have Herbert healthy and you get the right coach and GM, I don't think any of us foresee that they will have a top 5 pick again anytime soon. So this is probably kind of your last chance to really get a like premium blue chip top of the draft, player. So that's kind of why I mentioned those 3 or 4 guys as kind of my top 3 picks. As far as the second part of that question, I kind of rambled for a bit on the draft there, but do you think Spanos would be reluctant to hire Harbaugh due to some personality concerns? I don't really think personality concerns are the thing. I mean, I know Harbaugh's been known to kind of run hot in an NFL locker room. Kind of was sort of his undoing a little bit in San Francisco to some extent. But that team kind of was entering a little bit of a rebuild era anyway. I don't think it's personality concerns. To me, with Harbaugh, with Belichick as candidates, it's all about what level of control is Spanos and the Spanos family like willing to give them, right? Do they want more of the GM coach structure that they had with, say Telesco and Staley or Telesco and Lynn, right? And, sort of a combined effort, or are they willing to give one of those more, again, microscopic detail coaches who's going to manage everything, aka Harbaugh, Belichick? Are they willing to give that guy essentially full GM powers, right? Kind of what John Gruden had a couple of years ago with the Raiders, where he was really the GM and Mayock was more so kind of a figurehead, right? So I think that's what, will determine whether Harbaugh or Belichick or any of those types of candidates are legitimate possibilities. Burley Johnson, I'm thinking they need to bark up the Kansas City, Philly, San Francisco tree for their GM search. Things that they're able to do from a personnel standpoint are beyond the rest of the league. So not really a question, but getting to GM candidates, I do think that, look, teams are going to pick, guys from the teams that have been most successful, right? Like that's how GM searches kind of tend to go. Um, you know, so Philly has Alec Hallaby as obviously kind of like the number 2 guy to Howie Roseman right now. Adam Peters in San Francisco to John Lynch. You have Joe Ortiz in Baltimore. You have I can think Mike Borgonzi in Kansas City. So there's a lot of like of those types of names floating around that I think are interesting. I'll get to another candidate that I do have later in the show when we start talking about pairings and stuff like that I think could be interesting. But again, I think it's natural to take from the highest ranking guys in the league. Now, that doesn't mean that, okay, well, I'm going to hire the Philly guy because I want Howie Roseman, right? As we've seen with Joe Douglas in New York, that isn't necessarily how that works, right? Everybody is their own candidate, has their own draft tendencies and things that you have to talk about. Their own interest in like the free agent market and how they operate is different than, the front office that they come from. Everybody is kind of unique in their own way. So just because you're hiring a guy from Philly doesn't mean you're getting Howie Roseman. Just because you're hiring a guy from Kansas City doesn't mean you're getting Brett Veach, right? I think you can hire from the best places, but to me, while that matters, I do think it is more about what is the attitude and the plan from the candidate you're interviewing in question, because most of these guys, are going to come from the same place, from the same places that we recognize as the best teams in the league. But what do they themselves bring to the table is pretty important. Isabel Ankara, I am kind of surprised Nugent wasn't let go, considering how much the offensive line has struggled this season. So obviously referring to they let go of Jay Rogers as well, in addition to the Staley and Telesco firings, who was in charge of the defensive line run game. Are there any possible candidates out there to replace him with how things are set up? Oh, the offensive line will consist of the same players minus Lindsley, so I can't see any changes there. I don't know necessarily offensive line coach candidates. I haven't dug certainly that far into the process, but I think in general that probably will be a pretty big focus, especially like a guy like Belichick loves micromanaging, the offensive line. With the history there of Dante Scarnecchia and, the long line of great offensive line play in New England until somewhat recently. I think you'll have a lot of candidates that do want to build through the trenches. So we'll see how that goes. I know this will depend on the degree of rebuild this team will have, but can you rank the big 4 contract players? So big 4 obviously refers to Khalil Mack, Joey Bosa, Mike Williams, and Keenan Allen, and the guys they restructured last year. By likeliness of staying. Seems less predictable with new GM and head coach, as well as the current vibes in the locker room right now. So this is an interesting question because honestly, prior to Telesco getting fired, in addition to Staley, I was pretty locked in on Keenan is most likely to stay. Khalil is probably second most likely to stay out of that big 4. And then I would put Joey 3, Mike 4, maybe. Like that was kind of my order that I had thought about prior to Telesco getting fired. But Telesco getting fired changes the whole calculus, right? And I even thought about this in the context of Keenan, right? I think Keenan in 80 or 90% of the GM scenarios, that they will go through, or simulations, if you will be back with the Chargers. I think it is pretty likely. They're not going to rip Justin Herbert with, away from a guy who he has chemistry with that's still producing at a high level. But I do kind of wonder what is the extent of the rebuild that the new GM will want in place, right? Do they kind of want to, still have like Mac, Keenan, I'll kind of throw Derwin into this group too, because I think his name may come up in like trade talks over the course of the offseason. But how exactly do they want to restructure this team in terms of, do they want to get rid of everyone? Do they want to get rid of, like, let's say 2 of the big 4, like a lot of us have predicted? or is it more significant than that? Or is there a bit of a, or not close to a run it back attitude, but more of like a half measure than a full measure? Because a full measure, again, could be very drastic and say getting rid of 3 or 4 of the big 4 in theory. I would say 3 outside of Allen. But again, it kind of goes into, what do they want for 2024 and 2025? Do they want to just go all in on, not all in, sorry, that's a triggering term. Do they want to go, kind of bottom out in 2024 and get rid of all of those contracts at the same time? Or do they kind of want to like shelter that burden between 2024 and 2025? So I think that'll be kind of an interesting question. I still kind of would stick with the same ranking, but I also do think it's probably implicated by whether Khalil Mack wants a trade or not. And I don't know enough to say what he wants at this point. Brandon Staley was a pretty big reason that he did end up coming here. So I don't know if that changes his perception along with now a new GM. This comes from our, I don't know how to pronounce this. I'll just say Roar. I have several questions and I don't know. And I feel a lot of the fan base don't know the answers to. Number one, it's almost unheard of for head coaches to be hired mid-season, but is that the same for a GM? Yeah, I mean, a lot of the GM candidates are going to be hired in the offseason as well. I think the rule is now like a lot of the GM head coach stuff that can start after the second round of the playoffs. I think that's the rule that they made. So starting like championship weekend, essentially. So it's not fully after the offseason, but I think the rule used to be after wild card weekend. So now they've like moved that back a little bit in terms of the timeline. A GM candidate probably will not be hired midseason. I a lot of these guys are working with their own teams, so it is the same thing. The only thing that would stick out there is like Jim Harbaugh, because Harbaugh will essentially, I mean, he'll be focused at Michigan, obviously, for the duration of this season. But technically, the Chargers, I guess, could talk to Harbaugh at any time they wanted because, again, he's not like NFL personnel, but everyone else that they would obviously want to talk to is NFL personnel. So GM would be hired after the season. Number two, draft prep is a year-round process. Does a GM hired after the season struggle due to needing more time to construct a scouting department, a self-scouting team, collecting information on college prospects? I'd like to see what the research says on this. This might be more of like an Arjun question of like, do new GMs statistically like struggle in the draft compared to other GMs? I don't really believe that to be the case. And like a lot of times, a lot of these GMs like kind of know to some extent like who are the guys that they would hire, right? Friends, people they've built relationships with, in the league for years. Like I do think they have a plan in place, usually maybe when they go in for an interview of like, hey, I want this guy. This guy's an assistant GM. I want these people in my scouting department, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So, I don't think personally I do think there is a lot of work in terms of like setting that structure up, but I don't think it necessarily takes away from the draft and free agency, especially because you have to hit the ground running on both anyway. Like there kind of is no choice, considering when like the GM would be hired. Number three, Telesco is obviously responsible for coaching hires. Would a new GM also be responsible for hiring head coach, or is that decision left to ownership? I wouldn't say Telesco was fully responsible for coaching hires. I would say that was probably to some extent both, him and the Spanoses as well, considering that John Spanos is in the front office still, and I don't expect that to change. And you still have Dean Spanos, who obviously is the owner, who's going to have the final call on who the coach is. So yeah, I think that it depends on what route they want to go. If they're hiring a Ben Johnson, if they want to go through a standard GM search and decide the coach afterwards, then the GM would obviously be in place before the head coach and like have ideas of who they want to hire and work with ownership on that. But if Spanos says, fuck the GM for lack of a better term, and says, I want Belichick, I want Harbaugh, then like that itself is like a different situation. I'm not saying the GM doesn't matter in that case, but again, with how much micromanaging both of those guys do, they are effectively the GM. So again, like I do think that kind of matters in this conversation if either of those two truly end up being legitimate candidates. Tony Nguyen, not that I want him, but any chance of John Gruden if he wants back into coaching? The Chargers are not hiring John Gruden. I think I could put that one to bed. I have no idea if the league has decided that they've forgiven John Gruden or if he'll go to coach in college or something, but I tend to think he's probably pretty done in the NFL with all of the legal stuff. But hey, you never know. LDE Bruin, Harbaugh is my favorite choice, and if that's who the Chargers want to target, do you also expect him to be hired before a new GM? I have a feeling they'll go the Quinn Moore route instead. Not ideal. I don't think Harbaugh would be hired formally like before the GM in some order, but I think like if you realistically are hiring, if Spanos really has this desire again to hire a Harbaugh type Belichick, like that obviously kind of would take precedent over who the GM is versus if they actually conduct a thorough GM search and let's say they want to hire Ben Johnson, right? Like the GM would come before that cart. But in the event that he does want to pursue Harbaugh, I don't think the GM thing gets figured out first. I think that would become a secondary thing. I don't think him or Belichick, again, like I've said, is willing to like cede power in that way. Jacob Vaso, I'm hoping for an offensive-minded head coach and have him with Kellen Moore. So, he's talking about like situations where you could hire Ben Johnson or Frank Smith and pair them with Kellen Moore and being the offensive coordinator. Yeah, that's not going to happen. If Kellen Moore does not have play calling duties, he's not going to be here as offensive coordinator next year. I don't know if the Chargers want him back. I'm sure there are scenarios like the Dan Quinn scenario where he could return. But yeah, there's no scenario in which Kellen Moore is coming back without play calling duties. I think considering the full cleaning of house with Telesco and Staley, I think it's kind of unlikely that Moore is back anyway, but he's certainly not coming back being paired with an offensive coordinator higher in like a Ben Johnson or Frank Smith. If he doesn't have play calling duties, he's out. At Cat and Quincy, if Chargers ownership for some reason is dead set on having another first-time head coach, who is the best possible candidate? I want to talk about this because I talked about this with people yesterday on Twitter. I completely understand why the last three head coaching hires for the Chargers would lead fans to go, we can't have another first-time guy. But I would also like to remind you that all three of those first-time guys were hired by the same GM. Like, not having Telesco like absolutely impacts your search and the ability to have a first-time head coach. Because if you are getting a new GM here who has a clear vision for this team, to me, having a first-year head coach isn't a concern if you're getting the right guy, right? And you're having the right management in place. Because a lot of the reason that Staley and Telesco and Mike McCoy had similar failures in personnel was Telesco. So would I trust Telesco hiring a fourth rookie first-time head coach? Hell no, I wouldn't. But would I trust another GM who the Chargers have done an extensive search on hiring a first-time head coach? Much more likely to do so than if it was Telesco hiring his fourth head coach. So I think that part of it is something that people are underselling in this whole like, do you want a first-time head coach versus do you want an experienced guy debate? Because the fact that the front office is changing in such a significant way with whoever they bring in, to me, would signal a potential opportunity to set up that first-year coach for more success. The other thing I would say is a lot of the offensive coordinators and defensive coordinators who are available are better candidates than Staley and Telesco, or Staley and Lynn and McCoy, right? Mike McCoy was a bottom-feeding OC who got Peyton Manning and then ended up being the best OC in that specific class. Anthony Lynn was an interim OC in Buffalo and had no experience calling, calling plays for any true amount of time, right? He was hired as leadership guy. That 2017 cycle was also weaker because the Chargers were moving to LA and nobody wanted that job. And Staley was hired after 1 year with the Rams during COVID, after having Jalen Ramsey and Aaron Donald. The 2 years that Ben Johnson has put together in Detroit, he beats any of those potential candidates, right? Like, and you see what he's been able to do, revitalizing Jared Goff's career, and getting movement into his offense. The motioning, like he has made that engine go. And I see people, saying like, oh, he's a, like, oh, he's gotten Sam Laporta and Amon-Ra St. Brown to like to lead his offense for him. Those guys get the credit. I'm like, are we really like taking away Ben Johnson and what he does because of the players that he has in Detroit, as though he has all these like studs on this team, like the Eagles or the Niners or something? The Lions are not that loaded. Ben Johnson has done wonders with that offense. And to me, again, if you're hiring a first time head coach, Ben Johnson is without a doubt my number one option with what he's done with the Lions. And, again, having stability around Herbert with an offensive mind, that's so important. And if you're asking me, hey, you have to bet your entire life savings that one candidate of this class ends up being the Sean McVay, the Kyle Shanahan, et cetera, of this group, I would bet on it being Ben Johnson. Maybe Ben Johnson would completely fail as a head coach. I don't know. But from what I've seen in Detroit and from what I've watched in Detroit over the last 2 years of watching the Lions games that I have, like he is a stud. You saw him go into SoFi and put up 41 points. You just saw him put up 42 on a pretty good Denver defense with how they've been playing recently. Last night, as I'm recording this on a Sunday, to me, if they want to go with a first time head coach, and I even say this as someone, he's my top head coaching candidate, regardless. I have him over Harbaugh, I have him over Belichick. To me, regardless of his experience, I think if you're trying to get that offensive direction around Justin Herbert going in the right way, and you don't want to hire an OC and you don't want to change the whole game plan every year, which is something this Chargers team has struggled with, you go with Ben Johnson. So he's my number one overall candidate. So I just wanted to put that to bed, I guess, and reveal myself in the 27th minute of this pod. Let's see. This comes from Easy Shot. So this is 2 comments. One, he says, no more first-time head coaches. Yeah, we just had this conversation. But, again, the other problem with like the no more first-time head coaches approach, okay, what if Harbaugh wants to go back to Michigan? What if Belichick just decides he wants to retire or go to the Commanders instead? All right, well, suddenly we're out of head coaching candidates, and it's Dan Quinn. Does he want to stay in Dallas? Does he want the Chargers job? Again, I totally get you, but it is a fundamentally bad process to just say we don't want any first-time head coaches, right? Because again, you're ignoring the GM difference, and if Harbaugh or Belichick decide they don't want to come here, you're kind of fucked. So you have to interview every candidate and go through the whole process, right? Like this is not just the thing where you can lock in on one guy and get your hopes up, and then turns out like the last 18 times he's wanted NFL interest, Jim Harbaugh signs an extension with Michigan, which he's done multiple times now. Belichick may very well decide he wants to go to the Commanders. You have to broaden out your search as much as possible and get the right GM and head coach, this time. To me, you're limiting your options if you're only going for the experienced guys who may or may not want to come here, right? So to me, I don't agree that experience means that this candidate is better. Every candidate sells their own thing in their own way. And to be honest, I think there are several coordinators who are more qualified than, Staley and Lynn and McCoy were at their various times of interviewing with the Chargers. So I don't know. I know, again, a lot of people are on the Harbaugh narcotic right now. So I like Jim Harbaugh. He's probably my second or third candidate. I just don't think he's number one above all these candidates by far. I'm not in that position yet as a fan. Again, more Harbaugh stuff, not really questions. So let's get to the questions over from Twitter. Nationals asks, who are your top GM candidates? As I mentioned before, I think you look at some of the guys around the league, like Halaby, I mentioned, Borgonzi. you look at those guys, Adam Peters. To me, because I just said, and I guess I'll get into this now, because I just said Ben Johnson to me is my top candidate. I think Ray Agnew, potentially coming over from Detroit and kind of doing what Shane and Dable did a couple of years ago, going from the Bills to the Giants, right? Having that pairing of a guy who would then come to LA, and you have this GM and head coach who are on the same page, same place from the same page, right? I think that would be pretty interesting. So Ray Agnew is another guy under Brad Holmes in Detroit. He was also under Les Snead with the Rams. That's an interesting setup to me. So Ray Agnew is a guy that I would also look at as well. Nigel Martin, say we have a top 5-6 pick. Do you see us trading back to the mid-teens for a second and a fourth? Not sure the trade value for that. It let us get the best cornerback or edge, then use our round 2 picks for another defensive player, maybe a tight end. Let's fill our roster with top 100 talent. If they trade from number 5 to the mid-teens, they're getting a first-round pick. That's how that works. So, or it would be a future first scenario, kind of like the Dolphins-Eagles trade a couple of years ago, where it was the Dolphins who traded up to, or the Dolphins traded. They traded back with the Niners and then traded back up with the Eagles. I'm thinking of that 2021 draft. And then the Eagles traded back. So they would be getting a future first if they were to go back from number 5 to the mid-teens. In terms of trading back, considering we're hiring a new GM who might realize that trading back exists, I'm all for trading back. I'm for either strategy, whether that's getting the premier player like a Neighbors or a Bowers now, or multiplying that into 2 picks. I think that would be a great idea. If the Chargers want to, again, fill out this roster, who I do think has a lot of holes and not a lot of financial wherewithal to fix some of their issues. So if they want to trade back, I am all for that. Stephen Gillard, since it's your last one of the season, can you give us a trade, cut, keep, re-sign breakdown on what you would do if you're the new GM? Also for trade, who would you shop? Obviously, it takes 2 to tango, and it's hard to predict value currently. Cut, keep, re-sign breakdown. Again, a lot of this refers to kind of like the big 4 and Derwin. I'm of the mindset that you keep Keenan. I am of the mindset that you probably shop Khalil Mack. Not because like he, I don't know if he's going to want to be here to begin with, but he just had, he's leading the NFL in sacks, probably having one of the top years of his career. I think for a team that is rebuilding as opposed to going all in for a title, like I kind of would think that like you could get some pretty good value for Khalil Mack. Maybe that 2nd and 6th round pick the Chargers originally traded him for back in the day, or maybe it's like a 3rd and a 5th or something like that. Anyway, more picks is good. And I kind of think if you want to like sell Khalil Mack at his high while you're trying to accumulate all these assets, I kind of would consider it. Again, get the right offer in there, right? If not, then you run it back with Khalil for 2024 and let him play on the expiring, or find a way to extend his contract. But I do think there will be a lot of teams who would be interested in Khalil's expiring that you could get some pretty good value for a team that's going to be rebuilding. Like that to me would be the interesting thing that I would pursue. I think you probably get rid of Mike and Bosa at this point. Clearly they drafted Quentin Johnson with the intention that they were getting rid of Mike. And with Bosa, simply hasn't been able to stay healthy. Mike hasn't been able to either. I don't know what you would get in return packages for either of those players. But yeah, so keep Keenan, trade or keep Khalil, depending on, what you want to investigate there. Probably cut or trade Bosa and Mike Williams. And then I'll say the last one that I mentioned earlier is Derwin James. I think that you at least look into what the trade market for Derwin James, who was an all-pro last year, looks like, considering how he's played the last half of the season. If not, if you don't get the right package for Derwin, then bring him back and try to revitalize some of his value in 2024. I have no problem with that. but I would be interested to see what he could get on the trade market. You know, that's all I would say. Kind of in the same vein of like keep him, uh, but also look around. Um, how do teams narrow down first-time GM hires? This is from Jared Wright, Wrong Speedy. How do teams narrow down first-time GM hires? Seems like there are a lot of GM trees, not unlike coaching ones, but org chart-wise, I don't understand the movement up. So there's a lot of different ways that GMs and like a lot of these assistants have different titles. So you'll see like assistant GM. You'll look at somebody like Joe Ortiz in Baltimore, who's considered director of player personnel. So there's a lot of different titles, but ultimately I think a lot of this is like a who do you know who knows who in the league type of thing, in terms of like poaching from other front offices, because everybody around the league will have different opinions about like which guys in which front office are good, right? So I don't think it's necessarily that the assistant GM is always the one who gets hired. There's other guys in the front office too that might get looked at. But yeah, in general, I would say the number two guys, whether that's the director of player personnel or the direct assistant GM, whomever it might be, whoever is number two in charge is usually going to be the one looking for other jobs. So that is kind of the flow chart up. I actually don't think it's all that different from OC, OC to head coach or DC to head coach in terms of promotion. Just you're not going to get that, GM opportunity in the city you're currently in. So you look around if there is a GM opening. And I think the other thing that I would just say about the GM opening, and Arjun like kind of said this on the podcast that me, Steven, and him did on Friday, GM openings don't become available, right? Like they just very rarely end up truly opening. So I think the fact that you would be getting, this opening is a big deal, right? In terms for GMs around the league, there may truly not be that many openings that come available, and so certainly GM jobs and this Chargers job around Justin Herbert is not going to come open maybe forever again in Herbert's prime. Assuming that they hire the right guy, and ownership has generally been pretty patient with their GMs in the past, right, and given them a pretty long rope. So, I think the fact that you never know when this job is going to become open again, and GM jobs certainly don't become open nearly as quickly as head coaching jobs. That's another factor to consider in this head coaching search, and just like, or in this GM search, and just how valuable that is for the Chargers. We answered Ryan's questions earlier. Nigel Martin, do you think we cut Eck and let Murray walk? Obviously talking to, cut Eric sorry, I thought we were talking about Eckler. Cut Eric Kendricks, he's talking about EK, and let Murray walk. We can draft a third or fourth round linebacker and let Henley, Neiman, and the new rookie and veteran compete in our room. Helps with cap space and improves our linebacker coverage. Yeah, I think regardless of what GM they bring in, Eric Kendricks is most likely done. He was kind of signed to a 2-year deal that was really a 1-year deal anyway, considering how that contract is set up. And I just don't see what the organizational interest would be in re-signing Kenneth Murray at this point, unless you could really bring him back for like kind of bottom tier like value, and he's willing to take like a backup role as like a run defender. But again, why would he come back to Los Angeles and like play second fiddle to Dion Henley, right? Or whomever the Chargers acquire or draft in the offseason, So I think the relationship there is pretty done. And I think they see what they have in Dion next year for sure. But also whoever, the thing about hiring a new GM now, particularly when looking at last year's draft class, is like, how many of those guys is the new GM going to want? Right. Like that is a decent question, considering that is the last Telesco draft class. All right. How high is the new GM on Quentin Johnson? I think that's a question. Not that like it would really result in a trade or anything like that, but I would be curious to see what the GM thinks of the last few Telesco draft classes and how many of those players, they could view as maybe long-term Chargers. So that's an interesting kind of question regarding like somebody like Dion, for example, because he was on a path last year, or next year, if Staley and Telesco are retained, to becoming one of the starting linebackers. but now is the new GM or head coach going to want him, right? Like to be in a starting role, right? Like that to me would be the question. But yeah, I definitely think Eric Kendricks and Kenneth Murray are going to be gone next year. Adam asked the same question. How do we go forward with our linebacker situation? Is there any particular free agents or picks in the draft we should gear towards? Honestly, I haven't started free agent linebackers and free agent draft discussion, but in general, Kendricks and Murray are both gone. I feel fairly confident in saying that right now. Randy Marks, what can we realistically get in compensation for Joey Bosa and Derwin James? Bosa is a little hard to peg because he is coming off of the injuries of the last number of years. He, is still a big player in terms of like name brand value, right? I think he was still ranked in the top 10 edge players in the Jeremy Fowler poll this year. Khalil Mack was another one of those guys who was in honorable mentions. But, the phrase in the NFL is the best ability is availability. And I think a lot of GMs are going to look at that. In regards to Bosa, I don't think he's untradeable. I think he could be traded. I just wonder what the value you get for him is. I don't know. I honestly don't know enough to say. Maybe like considering the availability concerns, I'm probably saying like somewhere between a third and a fifth. I think you get value back for him because edge is a premium position. I think you get value back for him because of his name brand value. But again, the fact that he hasn't been able to stay on the field and, teams are going to look at the numbers and teams are going to crunch him. I don't think you're getting a lot back for Joey Bosa. Derwin is an interesting scenario because I think in theory, being an all-pro as he was in 2022, like he's been more available compared to somebody like Joey Bosa recently. The thing is that Derwin is the highest paid safety. And, considering his level of play right now, our teams, dying to like trade for what would be a pretty big cap hit. He signed through 2026. I guess they can get off of it in 2025. But you're probably looking at keeping Derwin at his cap number or whatever it is for the next like 2 years. And with the way the NFL is going with like paying safeties who have not necessarily reset the market since Derwin, I kind of think that there would be a lot of GMs wary about like adding that type of a player to their team. I think there's a lot of teams that would kill themselves for Derwin specifically, but that contract, I don't know. Considering safety is not really viewed as one of the more premium positions, then you just had somebody like Howie Roseman like trade for Kevin Byard at the deadline, and he has him for the next 2 years, right? I just think there's other teams that people are figuring out, how to fill that hole without spending tons of money. And so that would be the question that I have about Derwin. Pick value, I'll say like a third. I think you could get something for him, but again, like the financial part of that trade would be kind of interesting. Mr. Junior, what do you feel about Alohi Gilman as our starter coming into next season, or Isaiah Spiller sharing RB1 duties next season? Again, GM head coach dependent kind of question here, but Alohi, would need to be re-signed. He was 20. I think this was the last year's deal because he was 2020 draft, right? He was the last pick under Lynn. Let me just make sure that I'm right on that. I think he was 2020 draft. But in general, I think you look, 2020 round 6. So his contract is over. At the end of the year, they would have to re-sign him again. Depends on how much new GM likes Alohi. I like how he's played this season. I wouldn't mind him like being the starter, but I think they'll explore all options regarding, do they want to trade Derwin? Do they want to re-sign Alohi? Do they not want to do that, right? I think it's a possibility, but they have to figure out what they want to do with Derwin, first, whoever the new GM is. Isaiah Spiller will be on the team next year, and like, interesting thing because Spiller was honestly one of the best parts of the Raiders game, which feels weird to say because he averaged 3.1 yards per carry, but he did play with a certain amount of like patience, and certainly probably was the best like cutting running back per, like athletic like cutting performance from a running back that we've seen this year. Um, just because Eckler and Joshua Kelly like have not been that great in between the tackles. So I actually think Spiller was pretty good at kind of waiting for lanes to open up and figure out what he wants to do in the backfield as a decision maker. So Spiller will definitely be on the team next year. He has 2 more years of a cheap rookie contract. RB1 duties, I don't know. Depends on what they do in the draft too, because there are some running backs I would say more so on day 2, day 3 that they could take a look at, especially if a new GM, new head coach gets their way. And Jim Harbaugh is our head coach, and he's staring down at not Blake Corum, because Blake Corum's like 45 years old, but Donovan Edwards would be kind of an interesting addition to this team. I guess I'm getting into who my day 2, day 3 running back guys are. But yeah, so that would be kind of interesting. But I think Spiller will definitely be probably at the very least RB2. I think on this team next year, considering the value of his contract, and I think the team, regardless of who the GM head coach is, I think he is probably still viewed as a decently positive asset. Stephen Gallard, give us your ideal staff next year, please. GM, head coach, defensive coordinator, offensive coordinator, special teams coordinator. Wow. Have not honestly perused like defensive coordinators that could be brought in for this team. Look, the defensive coordinator, offensive coordinator thing depends on who you hire, right? If you hire Ben Johnson, you're not really hiring an offensive coordinator. You're hiring, somebody to kind of like fill that role. But Ben would still have primary play calling. Same on the defensive side of the ball. If you really went after like a Brian Flores or a Mike McDonald, with them having control of the defense. But for me, I have not done all the legwork on like coordinators and stuff personally, but I still lean towards Ray Agnew as the GM choice. You pair him with Ben Johnson. I really want to bring Ficken back. I think the Chargers probably have some organizational incentive to bring Ryan Ficken back as well. So I think he has to be back as special teams coordinator. So in general, that's what I would say. Those 3 kind of combined. As far as offensive coordinator, I think Ben Johnson will effectively be that for the team. And, we'll look into defensive hires kind of when the time gets there in terms of guys and what they're doing around the league. Michael Lopez, say we lose out and end up picking 4th. Marvin Harrison Jr. is taken. Who you're taking? Pretty much the same guys that I mentioned earlier with the 5th pick question with Bowers, Neighbors, and I look at the 2 offensive tackles that are in the top 10. Should we trade Derwin? Obviously, I kind of got into that already. Let me see. I have a couple questions left. Given all the changes we know now, what do you think is the worst pick we could finish with, and how do you think the GM search will be conducted? Who interests you? So we already got into the GM stuff. Changes that we know now, and the worst pick we could finish with. Tankathon.com. Let me look at Tankathon and see what the order is right now. So the Chargers currently have the 5th pick. Although we have Chicago at 5-8, Jets at 5-8, Giants at 5-8, and Tennessee at 5-8. And I think the Chargers, if I'm correct, lose out on strength of schedule to all of those teams by a tiebreaker. So like if all those teams theoretically lost today, then the Chargers would be back at 10. So the Chargers are not like locked into picking at 5 by any means. They still need some help to get there. Since I do think they're going to lose out and probably be 5-12, I think they'll be somewhere between like 5 and 5, the 5th spot and like the 8th spot. Like if I had to bet, because I do think they are going to lose out pretty badly, considering who their last 3 opponents are coming up here. But yeah, I'll say they wind up between like 5th and 8th. Personally, the worst pick that I could see them getting is 4th. Like that's if they lose out and they get a lot of help from other teams, like Washington puts a couple wins together, because Washington currently has the 4th pick. But I think their ceiling is 4. Arizona is not winning 2 more games. I don't see New England winning 2 more games, so I think they would be pretty stuck in the 4 spot being like their ceiling this draft season. Todd Miller guesses on the draft capital in return for each of Bosa, Mack, and Mike Williams. I kind of already went into that, so not a whole lot that I have to say there. But yeah, we'll wrap it up there. Decent 50 minutes in terms of answering all your guys' questions. So truthfully, wish you guys all of the best. Happy holidays, Merry Christmas, all of that. I will be gone over break, like I said. So I'll be back probably around the week of the 12th, I would say, when I do end up returning to my island for school. So I'll be back around then and do bolt breakdowns and stuff after that. But I will be going on vacation with my family, so I will be gone for a while. So see you guys in 3 or 4 weeks. Hope for the best for the Chargers. I hope they don't get too blown out by the Bills in a game that I will not be watching live. But hope for the best for the rest of the season. I'm sorry from the bottom of my heart that this season went the way it did, but we always have the future. That's what we always have, baby. We have that top 5 draft pick right now. We have whatever head coach and GM makes you feel happy. Not gonna combat you too much on Belichick stuff. But yeah, so that'll do it for this Q&A. And I will see you guys in the new year in 2024. As always, bolt up.